and also Passage of India, Abhikshatanand, and the retrieval of the supernatural in Roman Catholicism. That's even more recent, published. His work on Catholicism in India has been published in numerous journals, including Journal of Hindu-Christian Studies, Studies in World Christianity, and Vidya Jyoti Journal of Theological Reflection. He holds a doctoral degree in theology and history and is senior lecturer in the Department of Philosophy and Religious Studies at Notre de Namur University in California. So may I request Dr. Enrico Beltramini to please make his presentation.
Of course. Greetings from California, and thank you very much for inviting me to this fantastic panel. I am very honored that Professor Bhargava is the chair of this session. Of course, we all learn a lot from his understanding of the Indian secularism. I teach in this Roman Catholic university close to San Francisco, and my specialization is Indian Christianity. So the idea today is to see secularism and potential post-secularism in India from both an intellectual, historical, but also a theological view. And I prepared some slides, so I will try now to show you the slides. Give me 1 second. Here you go. So I assume that some of you might have a chance to have a look to my paper. And so what I did was just to prepare a very short presentation and just to talk over the slides to make the conversation more easy. So the topic of this presentation is the potential passage from a secular to a post-secular India. And so the idea is that the raising religious nationalism is bringing a shift in what we consider the established Indian secularism, and he basically is pushing Indian secularism into a different phase, which can be called post-secular. This is basically the idea. And the assumption behind the paper is that this new religious Indian nationalism is here to stay. So I know some consider this new form of nationalism a diversion from the established Indian secularism. But the assumption behind this paper is rather than this new form of Indian nationalism as roots inside the Indian society, and then, as I said, is here to stay. So this is the assumption. What I didn't explain very much in the paper, because the paper was basically written for an audience of theologians, so they don't need my explanation, but probably in this case it might be useful, is what is political theology? Because some might think that political theology is theology applied to politics, but it is not, actually. Political theology is, in a very broadly sense, some kind of similarities or interactions between the two domains of theology on one side and politics on the other side. So if we can imagine some kind of relationships between the two domains, some kind of similarities between the two domains, some kinds of connection in a very general terms. That is a very acceptable, still quite general definition of political theology. However, even this very general or generic definition of political theology is not innocent. For the very simple reason that when we think about secularism in the West, not in India, but in the West, we assume some kind of separation between the religious and the secular. And so we also assume some kind of separation between theology and politics. And so in the very moment in which we assume on the opposite, that there is some kind of relationship between theology and the political, we are already in a different environment. We are already in an environment which is not secular in the Western way of thinking. So the second point I want to make is this idea that today in the West we are entering in a kind of post-secularism, and of course post-secularism can be defined in different ways. In my paper, I try to give two or three definitions of post-secularism. So one very popular is the idea that there is a return of religion. So we were secular and now we go back to religion. So it's a kind of a sequence. We were religious and then we forgot what religion is about, and now we go back to religion. This is a very popular way to see Western post-secularism. There is another way, which is alternative but equally important, which is the idea that in post-secularism, religion and the secular basically cohabit, so they stay together. So we learn what secularism is about, and now we have the possibility to coexistence of secularism and religion. This is, for example, what Charles Taylor says, that basically the religious is still with us, just changes its form. There is, however, another way, which is basically the one I pick up for this paper, that says that actually, to make it very simple, we have never been totally secular. The idea is that we believed that we were in a secular time, but in reality, we just didn't detect the presence of the religious in our secular world, to the point that actually we can imagine that the secular that we consider completely detached from the previous religious actually is a product of the religious. So actually, as Taylor says, we have a kind of secularism which is a deviation within the religious, and in the West, basically within Christianity. So basically, post-secularism is not the return of religion. It is not a simply cohabitation of religious and secular, but is actually the discovery, if you like, that secularism is just another form of the religious. And now that we discover that, we are ready to basically embrace post-secularism. So this is basically the idea of political theology, and the idea of Western post-secularism is the background through which I can enter into the discussion of Indian secularism and the crisis of Indian secularism. So it's very embarrassing to discuss the distinctiveness of Indian secularism in a panel with Professor Bhargava, who produced a lot of documents and materials on this kind of discussion. But to make it very simple, the distinctiveness of Indian secularism is the idea that secularism in India has nothing to do with secularism in the West. So the secularism in the West is basically based on the separation between the religious and the secular. It takes different forms, because if you go to France, you can find one kind of secularism. If you go to America, you can find a different form of secularism. But in a very general terms, the idea of the Western secularism is the idea of separation. In India, there is not the idea of separation of religious and the secular, for a simple reason that the religious element is fundamental in Indian society. And I don't go through all the debate that at the level of legislation, at the level of constitution of the Indian country, all the discussion of the Indian secularism went through. But I just want to say that Indian secularism is mostly the preservation of the religious pluralism that is embedded in the Indian society. And so the scope of a state at the federal level and at the state level is to protect the equality of the religious expression in India without any consideration of the majority and the minority of the presence of this religion. So today we live what has been called by many a crisis of Indian secularism. This crisis, of course, is very complex, and it takes many roads. But of course, for the sake of this presentation, I will try to be very simple. So the new Hindu nationalism that has taken roots in India in the last decades claim that the established Indian secularism is not really rooted in the Indian history, but rather is a byproduct of colonialism. And so basically, based on this argument, the Hindu nationalism is trying to delegitimate the Indian secularism, claiming that basically is a product external to the tradition of the Indian civilization, and rather claims that the very roots of the Indian civilization is the Hindu civilization. So and of course, Hindu here has to be understood in a religious way, but not only in a religious way. It's basically a much broader idea of what is Hinduism. So what is important in this discussion is that we have two different forms of Indian nationalism. The one that basically secular, which produced the independence and the constitution and the legislation of India after the independence. And now we have this different kind of nationalism, which basically means that the Hindu nationalism, that basically means that the secularism in India is not proper to India, but rather we have a religious, the religious roots of India. And so suddenly we have exactly the same situation as we have in the West, that what was called the secularism, distinct from the religious, suddenly we have a secularism that is actually a deviation of the religious. And so I want very briefly to explain why I think this crisis of Indian secularism is here to stay. Because in India, there are many that consider this is a temporary situation. Basically, a moment of crisis that eventually will go away as soon as this Hindu nationalism force will pass. And I think there are a few reasons why this crisis might stay. One, of course, is this idea that India in this moment is on the rise, and it doesn't need these colonial foundations. And in the very moment in which Indian secularism is framed as a byproduct of colonialism, we have this possibility to go beyond the secularism for the various reason that India doesn't need or probably doesn't want anymore any kind of colonial connection or colonial foundations. And there is another reason why I think that the crisis is here to stay, is this idea that is rooted in Indian nationalism, but not only that, is quite popular in the new middle class, in the urban centers of India, that says that the rise of India today is not a miracle, is not a unique event in the history of India. Rather, India has been a powerful country and a remarkable civilization in the past. And so basically, the rise of India today is not an accident, but rather is a return of the greatness of India of the past. But this past is not the past of the British India, is not the past of the post-British India. Is a past that goes well beyond that and basically comes from the very sources of Indian civilization, basically. And Hinduism is providing this kind of primordial, prehistorical foundation. So that's why I think that we can imagine, at least as a scholarly hypothesis, that the crisis of Indian secularism is here to stay. So I'm going to the end of my presentation. The old paper at the end says that in the passage to the post-secular, in understanding the post-secular not as a return to the religious, but rather as a new interpretation of the secular as a deviation or reformulation of the religious, we can see a less distinctiveness of the Indian secularism, or if you like, we can see a closeness between India and in the West in the passage to the post-secular than it was in the previous situation when the two were considered in the secular.
Thank you. Thank you, Dr. Beltramini. I now invite Mohammad Waqas Sajjad. Dr. Sajjad is an assistant professor at the Institute of Liberal Arts, University of Management and Technology in Lahore. He completed his doctoral program at the Graduate Theological Union, Berkeley, on a Fulbright scholarship, and wrote his dissertation on Deobandi Barelvi polemics in South Asia. He is interested in the discourses of religious scholars and Sufis in Pakistan, including their reading and writing of history, theological debates, issues of popular culture, and the depiction of religion in the media. Dr. Sajjad, please.
Thank you so much. I hope you can hear me fine. Just want to give you a quick, background to the paper that I've submitted for this conference. This was one of the chapters in the dissertation I wrote on the Deobandi and Barelvi polemics in South Asia. I was making a point here that in addition to the traditional structures, the traditional themes of the polemics and the debates they have about religion, about rituals, about religious figures, there is now an additional theme that has been added, for example, in the context of Pakistan, which is almost entire, which is a new theme, which is about political and historical writing. And that goes back to the different trajectories that ulama, the religious scholars from both these traditions, had in the British period, especially at the end of the British period before 1947. Just to briefly introduce them, these are two Sunni traditions that emerge in British India in the middle and latter half of the 19th century. They've become known somewhat incorrectly today as a division in terms of one group being more Sufistic and the other group being more legalistic. That's not really very relevant to my conversation here today, but that's one of the one of the tendencies to divide them into the binary through Sufism. What I want to say here today is that history writing, political historical writing, has become one of a new and important themes that they look at in order to identify themselves as legitimate Pakistanis today. The idea here is that legitimacy is no longer simply a matter of correct religious belief, but also depends on correct historical narratives aligned with national identity. So in this paper, I'll try to do so using Deobandi and Barelvi writings from the followers of both traditions today, writings that appropriate, justify, and explain different aspects of the political pasts of their own traditions and the competitors' traditions before 1947. So the questions broadly that I am trying to address below will include, how do Deobandi and Barelvi ulama see Muslim identity in British India? And what are their positions on the freedom movement and the separatist two-nation theory that ends up in the Pakistani narrative in the creation of Pakistan? And what are their positions about their own ulama whose opinions on these matters will diverge? In answering these questions, I will contrast Barelvi discourses today with Deobandi discourses about Ahmad Raza Khan, who is the founder of the Barelvi movement, and I will look at post-colonial Deobandi narratives about the Deobandi ulama under British rule, who have very different opinions about the future political outlook of Muslims in India. Some important names that will come up that I'm looking at are Ahmad Raza Khan, who is the founder of the Barelvi movement. There's Husain Ahmad. I'll talk about them once more, so when I get to them, of course, they'll come up once more. There's Husain Ahmad Madni, who is a Deobandi alim, a Deobandi scholar who supports the idea of a united India. There's Ashraf Ali Thanvi, another Deobandi contemporary of Husain Ahmad Madni, who is more along the lines of the two-nation theory that Pakistan has professed. And finally, I'll be talking a bit about the Congress, the Muslim League, and an important religious political organization called the Jamiyat-e-Ulama-e-Hind, which emerged in 1919 as an organization of the ulama dominated by Deobandis that will eventually support the Congress against the Muslim League. To begin with, let me look at Barelvi histories of some of these issues. Well, in order to tie their past to the state's historical narrative today, the Barelvis and the Deobandis will come up with some misreading of history, some manufacturing of history that shows how important that identity for them in Pakistan today is. This means that Deobandis, for example, will accuse Ahmad Raza Khan of being, quote unquote, a British agent opposed to all Muslim movements of his time and being silent on Christian takeover of Muslim lands. The goal is to show him as flawed, not just in the religious, but in the nationalistic context as well. Barelvi history in this regard is equally emphatic in portraying its own historical leadership, Ahmad Raza Khan, as bona fide Pakistani. In this history, and this comes across in multiple writings, in journals, in newspaper articles, in books published by the Barelvis, in these writings, Khan will at times be deemed to have explicitly started the movement for Pakistan all on his own, even though he passes away in 1921, for saving Sunni Islam from Muslim modernists and the British, for saving Aligarh College, which he actually opposed, and from preventing Muslims from preventing widespread Muslim exodus from India. In Barelvi narratives, then, he occupies a deeply political role. His organization becomes the platform for the Pakistan movement. His two-nation theory enables the Barelvis to end up completing his mission to create Pakistan. He's even described by some as a great and noble politician. Understandably, Barelvis will defend him from accusations that he was pro-British, which is something that Deobandis will often raise. And then they highlight in this regard his disdain for the British and note that he saw the entire European civilization as untrustworthy and against Islam. Some Barelvi authors will even credit him with jihad against the British in 1857, or at least not him, but his ancestors before him, his intellectual ancestors within the Barelvi tradition. And then they will say that it was these Barelvis who then joined Muslim League ranks and humiliate the ulama of the Congress. And here, the ulama of the Congress refers automatically to the Deobandis. In Barelvi worldview, this history is not just logical, it is necessary as part of the polemical exchanges they have with Deobandis today. In addition to linking Ahmad Raza Khan with the great ulama of the past in this regard, he is also tied to Pakistan's political founders and the political heroes of the country today, such as Muhammad Ali Jinnah and the poet-philosopher Allama Iqbal. As one Barelvi author will write about Ahmad Raza Khan and Muhammad Ali Jinnah in regards to the Khilafat movement of 1919, I quote, "There were two striking personalities who rendered maximum resistance to this Gandhian storm from their respective forums. Although one was a religious scholar and a peer, and the other was a Western-educated political leader, yet there was complete unanimity in their views and apprehension pertaining to the Khilafat and non-cooperation movement." In fact, end quote, in fact, there's a tendency to portray Jinnah as de facto Barelvi, which takes the spotlight also away from Jinnah's relationships with certain Deobandi ulama. Those Deobandi ulama, in fact, are called out for only siding with Jinnah for a while out of financial interests, and then when they find out they do not find any money from the righteous Muslim League, they will leave them and move on to the Congress. Of course, almost all of this is manufactured history. One Barelvi scholar's unique approach to grasp this historical narrative is very imaginative in its simplicity. He writes, "If one is to see that somebody is a Congressi Maulvi, a scholar attached to the Congress, one should just mention Ahmad Raza Khan's name in front of him. If he is happy and pleased, it is clear that he was with the movement for Pakistan, and if he becomes displeased, then he is a Congressi Maulvi and a supporter of Gandhi." As I show in my dissertation overall, these polemics have a very repetitive quality and they tend to be quite simplistic in their messaging. However, their audiences rely on such simplicity in order to come up with these very clear notion of who is right and who is wrong. In the Barelvi narratives, to continue, in Barelvi narratives, while the Deobandis are also taunted for their close ties to the British government, when it comes to Ahmad Raza Khan, writers, one of his biographers, who's Masood Ahmad, who writes a lot about him, they'll cite several examples from Ahmad Raza Khan's life to prove that he was not a supporter of the British. They'll defend his opposition to the Khilafat movement. So Masood Ahmad writes, I quote, "Imam Ahmad Raza Khan was against such Hindu-Muslim unity which elevated a polytheist to the highest pedestal of a saint at the hands of the Muslim ulama." Here he's pointing to the Deobandis accepting Mahatma Gandhi's leadership during the non-cooperation movement. Given the context in which this history is now being written and rewritten, polemicists can entirely alter facts as well. For instance, the claim that Ahmad Raza Khan, was in agreement with the cause of the Khilafat movement and just against the method used, which is incorrect because Ahmad Raza Khan was religiously against the Khilafat movement since he did not believe it to be a legitimate caliphate. Both Khan's followers and detractors then are keen to identify him as a deeply political figure. In some ways, I think they have an important point. Because of his influence, his apolitical positions also have a deeply political hue, especially in the way that his followers see them. I would extend this further and contend that while he is primarily concerned with everyday religious matters, for many Muslims, these became political in the face of rising Muslim nationalism. Khan is only part of that particular milieu. His few works on Muslim nationalism are strong and far from trivial. And his writings reflect the changing times, the emphasis shifting in topics about relationships with Hindus, relationships with the British, and relationships with other Muslims, even though he's quite consistent in his religious views, almost categorically stating that a righteous, believing Muslim, the Barelvis, should not be in any sort of collaboration, any sort of cooperation with any such group, even Muslim or outside of the Muslim or outside of Islam. He's deeply concerned with how Sunni identity is affected by politics. And this is clear in his writings, even if he's, I think, somewhere between an apolitical scholar that sometimes he's made out to be by scholarly writings and the politician that Deobandis and Barelvis make him out to be. When I come to his opponents, the Deobandis whom he criticized to no end, in fact, even called them kafirs outside of Islam, there are other fascinating histories that emerge both from the Barelvis and Deobandis. So the Jamiyat-e-Ulama Hind, the JUH, opposed separatism, which has led to a generalization that Deobandis were opposed to the creation of Pakistan in general. It is thus not surprising that polemicists from the Deobandi tradition strive to develop a history in line with the official state narrative of Pakistan. One way is to show their opponents, the Barelvis, as pro-British, against Pakistan, and hence religiously flawed, which is something I've mentioned before as well. In this narrative, they also allege that Barelvis destroyed their earlier fatwas, legal opinions, and their earlier texts from before 1947 in order to opportunistically call themselves bona fide Pakistanis and supporters of the Pakistani movement. A second approach is to portray the Deobandi ulama of the 19th century and beyond as having a mission with military, intellectual, and spiritual tendencies in order to protect Islam. In this narrative, they become the jihadis of 1857 who face retributions at the hands of the British and then enter the nationalistic struggle, ultimately creating Pakistan. The Barelvis are reminded that their ulama, their scholars actually wrote against Pakistan. When in reality, there are Deobandis who do the same. In reality, there are ambiguities in Deobandi writings that can be exploited by later generations according to their needs. Given the separatist and the nationalist trajectories of the Deobandi ulama before 1947 and the divergent histories of the tradition from India and Pakistan, divisions thus also emerge in Deobandi narratives today. Well, I'm not talking about the Indian Deobandi narrative, but I think just to mention it a bit, I want to note some Deobandi analyses from India would be unthinkable for Pakistani counterparts today, as they present the Muslim League as an unsuccessful organization working for the British. These divisive Deobandi narratives have come to be represented by two giants of the tradition, Husain Ahmad Madni, who passes away in 1957, who worked for a united India with the Congress and actually wrote against the Muslim League and its ideals, and the other scholar, probably maybe even a bigger name, Ashraf Ali Thanvi, who passes away in 1943, who had a better relationship with the Muslim League. The Pakistani Deobandi dilemma today is to extol both these scholars and then explain both their politics. Madni, for instance, has to be extolled because he's a Deobandi alim, a Deobandi scholar, but then his politics also have to be explained. Amjad Shakir, one Deobandi writer, for example, writes that Madni was pious, he had hatred of the British, he made political sacrifices, and it was his brave decision to stay on in India after 1947, despite threats to his life, as a selfless move to protect people from violence. Similarly, Thanvi is explained away by certain Indian Deobandis in a trend that started even in his life, right after his death, in fact. So, for example, right after his death, one of his contemporaries wrote that he was a deeply pious man. He avoided all political and worldly matters, including reading newspapers, something that people would exploit and feed him incorrect news in order to collect political opinions, fatwas of their choice. It is because of this, in this narrative, that Thanvi's writings in favor of the Muslim League come to us when earlier he had opposed it. One major Pakistani polemicist from the Deobandi tradition today is Ilyas Ghumman. His political history focused heavily on Thanvi, which is of course because Thanvi is one big name, one can affiliate with the Pakistan movement in one way or the other. However, he brings in detailed incidents that demonstrate the importance of this history in the polemical context between these two traditions. So Ghumman gives us entire narratives about, for example, Thanvi in 1928 presenting the basic structure of the idea of Pakistan, where a pure Islamic government, where every law is according to the Sharia, will be made. Of course, he ignores the Jamiyat-e-Ulama-e-Hind and Deobandi cooperation with Congress, which is also a very real thing. Probably a majority conception within the Deobandi tradition. Ghumman, however, presents Thanvi's ideological guidance to the League as evidence of his foresight regarding the Muslim League's eventual success, since he felt that its members could be transformed into pious Muslim men who can form a state where Islam is pervasive. He will give us details of Jinnah's meetings in 1938 with representatives of Ashraf Ali Thanvi, representatives who will ask Jinnah to pray regularly, and to whom Jinnah will confess that he was a sinner. He will admit that they are right to advise him, and he will note that it is necessary for him to listen to them, and after which he promises to pray regularly from then on. Ghumman also tells us details of a second meeting with the same representatives. Of course, these meetings aren't really part of any other historical narratives, but these are part of the Deobandi narratives, in which Jinnah is said to have listened to the representatives of Thanvi and understood that religion cannot be separate from politics in the case of Islam. Ghumman highlights extensive praise for Thanvi, who is weightier in stature than all the ulama put together in the eyes of Deobandi and in the eyes of Jinnah, and hence it's enough for him that the League was supported by Thanvi. As for Deobandi opposition to the League, the Jamiyat-e-Ulama-e-Hind and Maulana Husain Ahmad Madni, for example, there can be other approaches as well. So there is one approach of extolling or explaining away Madni's cooperation with the Congress and Madni's involvement with the Jamiyat-e-Ulama-e-Hind. But a rather novel approach also comes from a younger polemicist called Sajjad Khan Naqshbandi, who will take the unorthodox approach of owning up to Madni's opposition to Pakistan, his nationalist politics, and his support of the Congress. He'll do this by asking a few questions. He will criticize the critics of Madni for not understanding Madni's position, that Madni actually wanted an Islamic state. He will also ask them whether they see in Pakistan today what Madni had the foresight to see 70 years ago. A state where Muslims are not safe, a state where the religious scholars, the ulama, and their madrasas are being blamed for terrorism, where Muslims laugh at Islamic laws, and where laws honoring the Prophet are threatened by modernists and secularists. While this clears some way for him to validate Madni, it also opens him to some criticism from patriotic Barelvis who can then misuse his words. Naqshbandi's goal is to show that Madni's opposition to the League was not in the name of religion, but purely in principle, as was his alliance with the Congress, since he was primarily against the colonial powers looting India, which required a united struggle. But importantly, one that was within the Sharia, within the limits set by God. Naqshbandi points to the alliances of Barelvis in modern-day Pakistan with the sort of people whom Ahmad Raza Khan would not have called Muslim and would have prevented any Muslim from siding with. Why is this allowed in the name of political expedience, he asks, and Madni's alliances with other nations for the sake of freedom not allowed? Naqshbandi deceitfully counters the originally deceitful Barelvi notion that Ahmad Raza Khan began the two-nation ideology by noting that he had given a fatwa, in fact, for Muslims to join the Congress and was a sympathizer of the Hindus. It is only in the last 2 or 3 decades, he asserts, that the Barelvis have begun to make these claims without any historical reference. Of course, this claim of without any historical narrative, without any historical references, remains intact in the case of both sides of the polemics. On the other end, in the case of Pakistani narratives, the political contributions of the Jamiyat-e-Ulama-e-Hind ulama are completely missing, as their views of League leaders can sometimes be quite unpleasant. Instead, anti-British politics of all Deobandi ulama are highlighted in order to prove their authority and legitimacy which in the end will prove their authority and legitimacy in Pakistan today. I'll end with that. In the longer paper, I have other discussions about the positions of the ulama before 1947 as well, but I thought it better to stick to what future ulama, current ulama have been writing about this past. That fits in better with our conversation today. That's it. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Sajjad. May I now invite Dr. Razak Khan. He's a research fellow at the Center for Modern Indian Studies, University of Gottingen. He has edited special issues of the Journal of the Economic and Social History of the Orient and Comparative Studies in South Asia, Africa, and the Middle East. He is currently working on an intellectual biography of Syed Abid Husain. So, Dr. Khan.
Thank you. Am I audible at this stage? Thank you, Professor Bhargava. I'd like to share my screen, but I'm having a problem there. So, Rohit, if you could share the screen sharing option, maybe that would help. But let me begin nevertheless. So, I want to circulate. Yeah.
You want the screen sharing option? You should have the screen sharing option on an option called screen beside the camera, which is for the video.
Yeah, but somehow it's asking me system preferences and other stuff. Not now. Yeah. Okay. If we can't share it through the host option, I can also read my paper.
Also, you need to, I think, allow your video.
Okay. Am I audible?
Yes.
Okay. Okay. So let me begin by raising two of the key points that have already been raised. So if we are thinking of the categories that we might be interested in exploring, two of the issues that have been raised by previous papers is to think about crisis of secularism and the category, and I thought the last paper was interesting, of thinking about nationalism of the ulama. What I will be presenting is the genealogy of this crisis of secularism in Nehruvian India and the emergence of this category called the nationalist Indian Muslim in the aftermath of partition and their engagement with religious. So I mean, I suppose I'm providing a secular intellectual's engagement with Islam. Okay, and my case study is of Syed Abid Husain. So there exists a rich scholarship on India's first Prime Minister, Pandit Jawaharlal Nehru's writing and vision of modern and secular India. However, not much attention has been paid to Nehru's relationship with Islam and Muslims in the years after the partition of India. So this paper sort of looks at Nehru's vision of a modern and secular Indian Islam. So how might we think of Nehru's own political theology about Islam and his governmental policies towards creating one? And it also examines the agency and response by the writings of Syed Abid Husain, whose writing I'll be sort of exploring in this paper. Despite the partition's long shadow, Nehru assigned the Ministry of Education to Maulana Abul Kalam Azad, who was not only the exemplary nationalist Indian Muslim, and think of the category of the Maulana as the secular nationalist education minister for the Nehruvian Republic. Azad was also surrounded by other leading Muslim intellectuals, including Zakir Husain, Abid Husain, Mohammad Mujib, T.G. Syed, Humayun Kabir, and Khwaja Ahmad Abbas, among others. They were active both in government and in the larger educational and cultural sphere in Nehru's government. So, in fact, there is this larger intellectual circle of which Azad is one of the key representatives. And I think talking of the emphasis of this workshop on looking at minor figures within this canon would be interesting. And Syed Abid Husain, therefore, is a minor character within this larger intellectual milieu. So Sri Rupa Roy, in her insightful study of the Nehruvian Republic, has examined a series of documentaries commissioned by the Films Division, Ministry of Information and Broadcasting, Government of India. These documentaries have a particular section on Islam and Indian Muslim, Some of the titles include Muslims in India, a Muslim festival in secular India, and Centers for Islamic Studies. So I can show you an example of this. This would be, they can be bought even now from the archive of the Films Division. Thank you, Rohit, for putting this across now. Okay, so what is interesting and what this is what Roy's argument is, that this recognition is also the moment of separation. Yeah. So this series of documentaries are interesting because while they recognize the place of Muslim in Nehruvian Republic, at that very moment is also the moment of separation. Yeah. So there are a variety of films, including a film on Zakir Hussain, the exemplary other nationalist Muslim, and Eid celebration in his house. Yeah. There is also a documentary on Maulana Abul Kalam Azad. What I was interested in looking at was the Centers of Islamic Studies, and there are three documentaries there. One is on Aligarh Muslim University, the second one on Jamia Millia Islamia, and interestingly, this might be interesting for Waqas, a documentary on Deoband, although that came, I think, later under Indira Gandhi. Okay, so why was this interest in the Centers of Islamic Studies? This is my key interest in this paper. How might we think of the creation of knowledge about Islam itself as a secular project, not emanating from the ulamas, but from secular scholars of Islam, particularly in the post-partition context, is something that interests me. So following Amir Mufti's idea, I want to argue and further explore the discourse about minority as in fact a discourse about nationalism's own anxieties. So while nationalism produces minoritization, but the minority also represents an alternative perspective, one might say an uniquely interesting perspective on majoritarian democratic tradition. So however, post-colonial Indian nationalism needs to be also situated within a more extensive global intellectual history of Cold War, particularly the knowledge production about Islam globally. So I suppose I'm arguing that the history of nationalist Muslims or nationalist ulamas should in fact be taken out of that prefix of nationalist and should be situated in the global intellectual formation. So it is this interface between the national and global that I want to explore. And I want to do it through the life writings of Syed Abid Hussain, whom here you can see sitting on the right with a bunch of his other famous friends, including Zakir Hussain, Khwaja Abdul Hamid, who started the famous Sacral pharmacy that is in use for vaccine reasons now. So a whole set of nationalist Muslims, 4 of them moved to Berlin from Oxford as a mark of nationalism, boycott of British institution. But this movement from England to Germany is not just a spatial movement. What I'm arguing is that it is also an intellectual movement or a position of thinking of knowledge outside of imperial formation, of course, which would mean aligning with other European formation. But that might be a question worth exploring. How do we think of Europe and imperial categories? Is there a decolonial outside of Europe, or the decolonial emanates from an engagement from post-imperial or alongside challenging imperial formation? So that would be something that I would sort of suggest, that although interested in not just anti-colonial knowledge or decolonial knowledge, a scholar like Abid Hussain, starting from a princely milieu of Bhopal, moving to Allahabad, eventually studying in Germany, translating prolifically from German into Urdu, cannot be framed either through the category of the nationalist scholar or this global international scholar. There's something else that we have to sort of come up with, not in opposition to Europe, but as a reader of Europe's knowledge in a vernacular mode. Okay. So he, of course, studied philosophy. He translated a lot of German philosophical texts into Urdu, including Kant's Critique of Pure Reason, and I've written elsewhere about it. But he also translated work of Gandhi, Nehru, Iqbal, and Tagore into Urdu. So his main category, if one has to frame his, would be of a translator. And this is an important category that I want to bring back to the category of the intellectual as a translator. Okay, but let me come back to the main crux of my argument, which is to think about how to translate modern Islamic studies into Indian Muslim institutions. So here, if we can move to the next slide, Robert, we want to introduce a new important other character. This is, of course, Wilfred Cantwell Smith, the famous Islamic studies scholar of McGill University, but also, as I show in my writing, that he not only started the McGill Islamic Studies, but also at Harvard, at Dalhousie University, but also very importantly has a strong South Asian connection. This, of course, began with his own role as a missionary and scholar of South Asia. He started in Lahore, actually, at the former Christian College, and retained a very strong connection with South Asia. In fact, his first major book, as I show, is on modern Islam in India. And in that, he has this very interesting formulation about the three Indian Muslim universities, Aligarh, Jamia, and Osmania, as representing three different modes of knowledge production about Islam. And he sort of at that very moment thought Jamia would provide the most progressive model because of its internationalist training of its founding members. Okay, so in this section on the formation of modern Islamic studies, I sort of look at the broader canvas of making of institution. And if we can move to the next slide, here, he's of course not alone here. There's also the German Islamic studies scholar Annemarie Schimmel initially at Bonn University, where Abid Hussain met her, but also later on at Harvard. But if we can move further to the next slide, the McGill Islamic Studies Institute was a very interesting place because it also trained scholars and foreign policy makers. So here you can see Mushirul Haq teaching about Islam and Urdu to a range of people interested in South Asian Islam. Okay, so here is a section in this particular section, I talk about different institution making projects. It might be interesting here of also thinking about the debate in India, particularly Winfred Cantwell Smith collaboration with Dr. Kothari on the University Grant Commission about setting up of departments in various universities on comparative religion. Particularly, a good example of that was the Punjab University Patiala department. Okay. So the McGill University model is then sort of also being globalized, and India becomes a very interesting site. I must add that this is not just about university, but also involved funding agencies like Rockefeller Foundation. This image is from Rockefeller Foundation archive in New York, and also Ford Foundation at a later stage. So it might be quite interesting to sort of see of these foundation roles in terms of making a particular kind of knowledge production possible about India. I may also add at this stage that these were not just Indian scholars who were invited. Scholars like Iftidar Husain from Pakistan and other important Pakistani scholars of Islam were also invited to the same center. So they end up producing two different kinds of books about South Asian Islam funded by the same institution. So that's also very interesting history. Okay, so it might be worthwhile to note that the Department of Islamic Studies at Aligarh, in fact, was only established in 1954, and we have a discussion about why this department was being funded. It was, of course, done at the behest and under the leadership of Zakir Hussain, and he sort of goes on this long international tour, and he's also, of course, in touch with Winfred Cantwell Smith and others. So in making up of this modern Islamic studies, modern in the sense that it is not just about the history of Islam, but it's about contemporary salience for Indian state. Okay, so in a way, Islam is also being deployed in Nehruvian foreign policy, and Zakir Hussain does tour a lot of various Middle Eastern countries that I mentioned in my paper. Okay. An embodiment of this vision of a modern Islamic studies, of course, is the Zakir Hussain Institute of Islamic Studies in Jamia, established after the name of Zakir Hussain in 1971. And in the second and third half of the essay, I look at a journal published by this institute. If we can move to the next slide, This is, of course, Islam and the Modern Age, Islam or Asr-e-Jadid, a journal based on a society started by Abid Husain in 1967, which he edited till his death in 1978. Okay, and in the paper, I looked at how this society and this journal came about, who were the people who were contributing to it. But I suppose, apart from those empirical details which reveals its global formation, what I was interested in also looking at what are the categories, why and how the category of Islam and modernity are being translated by Syed Abid Husain. And I want to spend some time sort of exploring that issue, which is, of course, articulated in a far greater detail. If we can move to the last slide now. The Destiny of Indian Muslim, a book written by Syed Abid Husain. Okay. So, a couple of points in terms of the reading of these texts and what we might gain from this. This text, of course, is in the aftermath of Nehru's death in '64, and yet it is very much a text about Nehruvian vision, but its destiny in post-Nehruvian India, I suppose. And it's a text about a conversation about secularism, Islamic studies, and Muslim university, and how might Muslim be not in opposition, but in fact the greatest champion of secularism. But how is it that Abid Husain makes those contrasting connections? The book is written in a very interesting format in the framework of horizons of three parts or parts. The shadow of yesterday, the twilight today, and tomorrow, dark or bright. So in a sense, it looks at partition, post-partition, and the vision afterward. Okay. What I found quite interesting was a discourse about integration. So if the colonial Muslim discourse was marked by a discourse of separatism, a category that I think historians have also blindly taken up to create the category of the separatist versus nationalist Muslim, the category of integration, something that marks Nehruvian textual production, and not just of national integration, but also emotional integration, is also pervasive in Syed Abid Husain's own writing. However, in this discourse, he also sort of complicates this category by bringing in dialogue with Islamic concept and looking at how and why these may not be demands that are outside of it, but perhaps Muslims can look into their own civilizational history. I may also add that this text should also be read alongside another text called The National Culture of India, written by Syed Abid Husain. I've written about it elsewhere, and this text received the Sahitya Academy Award in 1956, and is in some way the precursor to The Destiny of India. Okay. So, and it's interesting, and perhaps we could discuss this in our discussion of Husain's categories of secular communalism, religious nationalism, and secular nationalism that he sort of identifies in Muslim intellectual history of India, and which he sort of ascribes to Sir Syed, Iqbal, and Badruddin Tayyibji. Okay, but the post-partition feeling of the intellectual formation is described by the feeling of despair, according to Abid Husain. However, what he sort of suggests here is that in order for Muslims to sort of engage with the question of secularism or modernity, they have to see of this not outside of Islam, but perhaps think of Islam within world history formation, in which, therefore, modernity is very much part of Islamic own history. In fact, he argues that Islam was the translator of modernity for a lot of other sections of the society. So in that context, both the category of modernity and Islam are sort of being reimagined in this new genealogy created by Abid Husain, so that modernity becomes not alien to Islam, but as part of world history and world culture. So this culturalization of modernity and sort of taking it out of its religious Christian origin is interesting, not in as an exercise of translation. So what I argue here is that Husain here is arguing for an Islamic genealogy and shared global intellectual history of modernity. In a chapter on nationalism, patriotism, and internationalism, he also criticizes what he calls a fetishist school of nationalism and patriotism, and he critiques the religious devotional model of worship of nation. In fact, he argues that nationalism has sort of been is another form of religious devotionalism, and sort of argues for Indians to participate in national building, not just on religious line, but in fact on purely secularized argument of nation building, and what he also calls a discourse of internationalism, but translated through the Islamic discourse of universal brotherhood. So there's variety of conceptual translation work at stake in this book. Okay. How much time do I have at this stage? Okay. So in the epilogue called A Desire and a Dream, Husain starts analytically, and I thought the emphasis on a desire and dream was quite interesting. And he says, and I quote, desire is more often for the unattainable rather than the attainable thing. So one might think of the unattainable desire of secularism. Hussein's desire for Islam in the modern age was connected with the hope that India was perfect, what he calls an exuberant garden, enriched by the sweat and blood of Muslims, which provided the ground for such a hope to materialize. So another important point I think I want to make here is that Hussain is insisting that it's precisely India and not a Muslim country like Pakistan or elsewhere that provides this unique potentiality for a Muslim minority reading of both secularism, but I would also argue democracy and a role of minority as, in fact, the true believer and carrier of the practice of democracy. Now, Mushirul Hassan has called the destiny of Indian Muslim as essentially a forecast of possibility in the aftermath of partition of India. Hassan writes about Syed Abid Husain that he, and I quote, occupied a special place among those Indian Muslim intellectuals who wanted to build bridges between religious faith and promote a liberal version of Islam. I here want to move beyond Hassan's very correct diagnosis, but perhaps a limited framing of Hussein's worldview. I want to, of course, move beyond reading Hussain within the nationalist frame and sort of expand both his larger intellectual formation of Islam and global history in his larger intellectual formation. He, of course, was part of the very interesting Weimar period Berlin, where he had engaged with a whole set of reading and writing of Iranian and other Muslim intellectuals, and a original debate about Islam in European context. This is, of course, a debate about Islam in Germany much before the integration discourse, but it might be worthwhile to go back to that discourse. Okay, so I quickly want to say some last concluding thought on the journal itself. The journal has had a long ride, but it is, of course, part of a large oeuvre of writing of Hussain on Islam and modernity, including in his newspaper writing called Nai Roshni in the 1950s, and his various other essays, where he sort of brings the historical again as important part of translation. And here I would like to mention his essay that he wrote in the Ahmadiyya Mosque German journal, which was a sort of a very interesting journal where scholars wrote about translation and religious dialogue between Christianity, Islam, and Judaism. And Abid Husain's essay on the Arabs in Spain was an interesting example, where he sort of says that this possibility of modern actually came when translation happened across religious and linguistic lines. So that essay is about the Moorish origin of European modernity itself. So in a way, the past is important for imagining a new future, particularly when the argument was that Islam is failing to imagine a relationship with modernity. Okay, the largest second point he made was to think of religion alongside with each other. So he insisted and encouraged comparative study of religion, something that, of course, Winfried Campbell-Smith is well known for. And a movement for these kind of department had already started in India. Tagore at Vishwabharati, and I've mentioned the Patiala University experiment under Professor Kothari's leadership, as well as in Jamia. There now exists a department in Jamia, a center for the study of comparative religion and civilization, which perhaps represent the last sort of remnant of Syed Abid Hussain vision in Jamia. If I may now quickly conclude, in the volume, in a volume called Islamic Transition, two scholars have sort of compared Abid Hussain's The Destiny of Indian Muslims with Maududi's Law and Constitution, which was written in 1955. And it would be very interesting to sort of come to this, but perhaps in lieu of time, I will leave it at that and sort of quickly sort of suggest that for Husain, a translation of both Islam and secularism are not practices of statecraft, but he reads them within a larger historical narrative and as part of world culture. So that I want to sort of move more forward towards that global reading of modernity and secularism rather than nationalist project that sort of allows us to sort of look at the question of Nehruvian secularism outside of nationalist framework. And perhaps that also allows us to look at the problematic and resolution of Islam under Nehru, but also sets the stage to see Indira Gandhi's relationship, for example, with Deoband and eventual movement of Rajiv Gandhi and the decision on the Muslim Personal Law Board. I'm not suggesting they're all connected, but I think we do need this larger reading of the policy towards Islam that is often highlighted under Rajiv Gandhi, but perhaps can better be understood by going back to the Nehruvian moment. And I rest my case on that. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Khan. We unfortunately have a technology issue. So if you could give us about a minute, I think, then we can resume.
My apology, I missed your message.
Dr. Jung-Kim, may I sort of interject and check whether Professor Bhargava can hear us? Sophie, is that fine?
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, so Professor Bhargava, can you hear us now? Has your audio been sorted? We could hear Dr. Razak. Okay, please try and connect to your mic. Yeah. Let us know if you speak, we'll get to know whether your mic is working. Professor Bhargava, can you hear us? Is your mic working?
I think he's re-entering.
Okay. Yeah, I think he has entered. So Professor Bhargava, can you hear us now? Yeah. I think the audio is working fine, Professor Bhargava. Can you hear us?
Yes, I've rejoined, so I'm fine now. I didn't hear the last few minutes of Razak, and I don't know whether Ekta has she begun?
No, she'll start. Dr. Jung-Kim will take over.
No, she's awaiting your introduction.
Hello.
Professor Bhargava, could you introduce our next speaker?
Yeah, sure. I'm sorry there was an interruption, and I'm very pleased that I've rejoined. So our next speaker is Ekta Bakshi. She's a final year PhD candidate in the Center for Women's Studies, Jawaharlal Nehru University in Delhi. She belongs to a third generation of a refugee family, and she has naturally been interested in the theme of partition since the very beginning of her academic career. She is interested not in the immediate aftermath of partition, but in its long durée. And the questions that she's particularly interested in asking are: how does the partition refugee live today, many years after the initial displacement, and how the location of refugees, both in terms of their physical location and their structural location in society, in relation to caste and gender hierarchies, how they've come to bear upon the trajectories that they've been able to trace for themselves. She's published 2 papers on her research work and presented her work at a number of national and international forums. So, Ekta, please.
Thank you, Professor Bhargava, for this introduction. And I'm audible, right?
Yeah.
Yes. Yeah. Good afternoon, everybody. I would like to start this paper by first acknowledging that the ideas that today I seek to present are not absolutely my own. They have been developed in discussion with Mr. Vishal Dev Haldar, and the idea that the academic concentration on the Hindu nationalist past, which is gaining popularity now, sort of leaves the present secularism of the Bhadralok elite unexamined was his idea, and I've drawn upon it, and how basically this polarity between secularism and communalism helps consolidate the Bhadralok hegemony is also from our discussions, and the critique of the CAA and what it means for Dalit Muslim unity has been drawn from the works of Mr. Shukriti Ranjan Biswas. So having said that, I begin my paper. This paper is an attempt to situate the retellings of the partition that exist in the larger popular domain in contemporary West Bengal. The partition story has gained fresh importance in the recent years, given the sharp religious polarization that has happened in the state and in the wake of the politics surrounding the NRC and the CAA, the National Register for Citizens and the Citizenship Amendment Act. The lens of this paper is more sociological than historical. I do not seek to explicate here the genesis of Hindu nationalism and secularism in India through the framework of caste, which has been duly done, and I'm happy to engage if that comes up. But here I'm interested more in the ways in which these terms come to be deployed in the political discourse of West Bengal today and in their relationship to the partition story. In the decades following the partition, several micro-histories of the event and its consequences by survivors and scholars alike have effectively centered the human cost that it entailed. And this has helped in forging symbolic communities of refugees united by memories. And it has successfully contested the notion that the partition was an essential cause for the birth of the nation. Yet this collective memory as a source of collective identity has also simplified and homogenized the refugee memory and the refugee identity, whereby differences and discontinuities are erased to present a seamless whole. Such homogeneous memories then can be said to be contributing towards the refugee-centric master narrative of the partition. Scholars such as Kaur, Pathak, Sen, Pramanik, Bandopadhyay and Boshu Rai Chaudhuri, especially in the context of Bengal, the last three have claimed that the erasures in the master narrative, however, are far from being random and reflect the already existing cleavages of caste, class, gender, and so on. The master narrative is then largely upper caste, middle class, and male. Even though it has been argued that the scale of the catastrophe, such as the partition, wiped out differences by rendering everybody equally displaced, the master narrative of the partition, unsurprisingly, have not gone unchallenged. A relatively recent challenge to the universe of partition memories has come from the anti-caste scholarship, which is sought to highlight how, rather than being a homogeneous experience, the journey of refugeehood was deeply inflected by the markings of caste. The Bengali Bhadralok Samaj, however, has acknowledged such narratives as an additive history, blunting any possibility of rethinking fundamentally through the frames through which we understand the partition, and the larger questions surrounding citizenship, nation, belonging, and so on that it engendered. It is my contention then that in contemporary Bengal, despite all kinds of challenges, two broad ways of conceptualizing the partition exist. The one I shall term is the secular liberal progressive version, while the other is the Hindu nationalist one. The major difference here that while the former argues for letting go of the past and healing the wounds through forgiving the Muslim other, while only partially recognizing that Hindus also engaged in violence, the latter calls for actively avenging the past by making Bengal Muslim free. At the immediate level, both are polar opposites in how they seek to resolve the pain and trauma of the partition. Yet, a closer look would reveal that both of them, in their shared assumptions about the causes and consequences of partition, betray any understanding of caste-based realities. And in espousing a caste-neutral understanding of the partition, and by emphasizing the secular versus fundamentalist interpretations as the paramount realm of political contestation, they reinforce the hegemony of the Bhadralok elite. The rest of the paper shall try to substantiate these claims, focusing on ethnography-based work among the SC and OBC refugee families in a non-metropolitan industrial city of West Bengal, namely Asansol. However, to just begin, one has to point out that there has been an increasing scholarship that, beginning with the most famous Joya Chatterjee's explication, that Bhadralok it was Hindu Bhadralok politics that brought about the partition, and was a prime mover in bringing about the partition. And though this was to thwart the Dalit Muslim unity and the rise of anti-caste forces as a major challenger in West Bengal, and Shumit Sarkar, Pradeep Datta have further elaborated on this point. Even though this has been a growing common sense, this is largely absent from the secular and progressive narratives alike in the public domain. However, whenever there is a selective recognition of the same in limited circles, this acknowledgement becomes a marker of decasting and undoing the Hindu fundamentalist roots of whereby the intelligentsia can claim a moral status as activists and maintain their hegemony, which I'm drawing from Uday Chandra's notion of the activists, and we can visit that later. And thereby they continued, however, these secular intelligentsia and the secular progressive elite continues to benefit from their caste privilege in every aspect of their life. Secondly, in both the aspects, the main trope of establishing victimhood is the nostalgia for the lost home. But the lost home is a land of bounty and abundance. And this eschews the caste and class exploitation that held that home together. And since loss is understood to be that of dhan, that is property, and man, that is prestige, it is difficult to register the loss of those who did not have either, namely the erstwhile untouchables. They have to fall back upon establishing loss of pran, or physical life, and in that sense they have to establish physical violence that had been done to them to claim any status of victimhood. We'll get back to this point very shortly again. The emphasis on the Bhadralok struggle for rehabilitation further is a common trope of both these narratives. This is both the political struggle and the economic struggle. And one must point out that this comes out from the left's progressive circles, the left-backed refugee movement. What I argue that in the moments immediately after the partition, even though the Bhadralok were the prime movers of the partition, there was a possibility of undoing some of the caste basis of citizenship in post constitutional West Bengal, because of how the caste-based landholding patterns had been disturbed. But soon enough, the Bhadralok claimed refugee status based on the refugee Bhadraloks claimed their legitimacy as citizens because of their normative identity, their affinity to the figure of the Hindu Bengali Bhadralok, who was the elite and who had social and cultural capital, who was the productive citizen. And in doing so, what they did was they created 4 categories of others. That is that the refugee others, the migrant others, the Muslim others, and the lower caste SC, OBC refugee others, who were not equally to be thought of as legitimate citizens as much as the Bhadralok refugees had the claim to citizenship in the nascent state of West Bengal, because they were productive citizens. They were not dependent on government help. So the problem was those citizens who were more dependent on government help. They were the real economic burden, and the state was, free to deal with them in a way that it deemed fit, with some amount of sympathy. Now, having said this background, I would like to come back to Asansol and say that given this context, and a lot of studies have shown that because of the particular attachment to their landed economy and because of their antecedent trajectories of coming to of leaving erstwhile East Bengal, often it was the low caste refugees who took shelter in the camps and were dependent on government help, and they had far less access to social and cultural capital. So these camp refugees were dispersed off after 1956 to different parts of the country, which were considered remote, to support industrial development. Now, whenever such things have been discussed, it has been thought of that West Bengal was a favorable location, and dispersal within West Bengal were favored by the camp refugees. But Asansol is a particular case which does not fit this notion. It was Asansol had from the late colonial period, Asansol had a system of in the coal mines of using caste-based labor, and under severe bonded conditions. I argue that, but after the partition and after the constitution came into effect, such conditions of bonded slavery must have been difficult to maintain, and refugee labor became a perfect candidate to suit such needs. The major difference that refugee labor had from the other kinds of labor was that other kinds of caste-based labor was that while the native Bauris and the Santhals, who were also the Santhals of the tribes, that these people had some connection to the agricultural economy and hence could support themselves. The Namashudras didn't have, the Namashudra refugees, who were the largely lower caste refugees in Bengal, and the OBC refugees, they didn't have access to agricultural economy anymore. Primarily, they were also agriculturalists. So they had to now suddenly change into the role of an industrial laborer. Now, I could go into the one. I would like to read one of the quotes which points out why, first of all, these communities left and what it meant for them. So these communities, it must be remembered, were gaining some sort of social and political mobility in these given the circumstances in erstwhile East Bengal because of their political mobilizations. But when all the Hindus who can be largely assumed to be upper caste in administrative positions and the police had accepted the government offer to be transferred to India and had left, now everywhere it was their people, meaning the Muslims, who would protect us. Yes, we were able to protect us. We were strong. But let me tell you a story. What my teacher told me: once a flock of goats and sheep were left to graze. Suddenly they saw clouds in the sky. The goats began to panic and started leaving, but the sheep thought, why should we care? We have a thick covering. But then it began to rain very heavily and the sheep got drenched and could not move because their wool had become all wet and heavy. Now I did not want to become that sheep. That's why I left. So this quote tells us that the Namashudra peasants, this is by a Namashudra peasant who had become a tailor on coming to Asansol, that they were tied to the landed economy. They were gaining socio-economic mobility. They did not see themselves largely as a part of the Hindu order. That's why they are saying that when the Hindus largely left, that they wanted to stay back in East Bengal. But when the upper caste Hindus left and the administrative positions were largely filled by the Muslims, and given the increasing communalization of the bureaucracy and how citizenship was being understood, these Namashudra peasants in Pakistan got marked as Hindus, and then they were then in case of any emergency, then they had no access to administrative recourse, right? Either physical or sexual violence, either land being taken away, or because the contest between land-hungry Muslim and Namashudra peasants has been quite a theme. But now they had no administrative recourse, and finally, even when they were their lives and livelihoods were threatened by the changing course of the river, they could expect very little government help. So even, but coming to, so the camp life then in comparison was slightly stable period in their lives because there was some amount of security. So the period after coming to Asansol is what they understood as the most difficult period in their lives. This is because I said that they had to work as laborers, suddenly coming from an agricultural background, and the factory wages were abysmally low. First of all, there was not much work to be found, and they had to, one day they were laying railway tracks, the other day they were making metal roads, the other day they were cleaning bushes, and all these properties would then eventually, after reclaiming and redeveloping, would go to the upper caste or the state. But later, when they even found factory employment, the wages were abysmally low and it was not sustainable. So they joined largely the informal sector, where it became difficult for them to stick out. It was extremely arduous physical work, and then there were major periods of falling sick. Having said that, those who could stick to the formal work, they did get, the conditions did get somewhat better for them, and there was some amount of social and economic mobility. But soon, from the 1980s, with the onset of globalization and liberalization in Asansol, or the Asansol, which was developed as a hub of state-sponsored industrial activity, the industries and factories started closing down, and there was large-scale unemployment. And again, this labor force was thrown onto becoming precarious labor. So how do we now, in this sense, then understand the loss of the SC-OBC refugees? I argue that firstly, even though caste played a role, unlike the rest of India, in their case, in contributing to their condition, unlike the rest of India, it could not be acknowledged because West Bengal had already come to be declared as caste-free. Secondly, every attempt at caste-based mobilization from the SCs and OBCs who are caste was violently resisted by the Communist Party, and which, of course, took its most brutal form in the Marijhapi massacre. And then the present ruling party has been only slightly more ambivalent towards these groups. This does not mean that they were not politically active. Their political activism happened within the rubric of being industrial laborers. But again, then, within the trade union movements in Asansol, there has been a long history of upper caste political organizers who are not industrial workers themselves, or even when they're industrial workers, they're not blue-collar workers who are coming in sort of organizing the workers, and therefore in the trade union leadership, the upper caste hegemony was quite unchallenged, which meant that the voices of these workers were not quite heard, and further into what Bhattacharya calls the party society becoming paramount even in Asansol, we see that their active political past in the later years of the consolidation of the Communist Party's political power, they became a clientele to the party, a trend which continues now and dependent on the party for their welfare endowments, especially because the citizenship status remained liminal. Under these conditions, their political valence was greatly reduced. Now, start. I just have two statements where one of the peasants, one of the erstwhile Namur refugees who was a factory worker who lost his job and now runs a tea stall. He said that when he was thinking about the partition, he said we have 7 bighas of land in East Bengal, but if you go and try to claim this, they will kill you. So the Muslims will never let you have the land. Then again, in another conversation that I sort of eavesdropped, I overheard while traveling in an auto, a refugee auto driver, SC, OBC largely, was he was of the opinion that if you wear a skull cap, the police will never check for papers. So the government is appeasing. What is important to recognize that in both these cases, especially in the second case, it's not that the Muslims in Asansol, who are a significant majority here, that they have any better conditions given by the government, which is understood as Muslim appeasement. But in the everyday negotiations with the state, because they act as a vote bloc, they have been allowed to consolidate as a vote bloc. They are given some sort of concessions, which has not led to any significant social or economic mobility. But given there is a tight competition between the autos literally ply on the same roads with the limited amount of customers, it creates this sense of Muslim appeasement for this anger about Muslim appeasement in the Namur refugees. It also and in the earlier statement also, we see that there's not much nostalgia about the land and bounty and everything, but the bountiful land, but it's about the amount of economic stability one could have. So here I evoke Suman Nath's notion of cultural misrecognition to show that how the failure of refugee rehabilitation, the failure of Bhadralok politics to understand and react to the particular needs of the SCOBC refugees, and the failure of state welfare mechanisms has created a kind of anger that is now directed by the Bhadralok state machinery to different parties against the Muslims. And however, if the Hindu nationalist parties actively stoke this anger, the reaction of the other the secular progressive elite in particular in today's times is to tell them that this anger it doesn't even exist, or to have a Dalit Muslim unity, one has to let go of that anger. And it in fact, the Namasudra anger SCOBC anger is understood as something that is illegitimate instead of locating it in the failure of the state. Furthermore, this is the case with the legal uncertainty surrounding the citizenship status. The recent right-wing state's decision to grant citizenship on the basis of persecution to Hindu refugees, unlike what it is being told now, does not form a break, but rather continuity in the trend of how the Indian state has always viewed the Hindu refugees. As the Hindu Bhadralok refugees sought their legitimacy as citizens who do not depend on government help, assimilation and government help, this became the dominant model of seeking citizenship for the refugees, and those who had to seek government help became the problem, like I just told earlier. So the only way they could be accepted by the sympathetic state is if they talked about some real violence. Therefore, this language of persecution is very much present. To gain legitimacy as refugees or citizens, this language of persecution is very much a part of the liberal discourse as much as the Hindu nationalist discourse now. So, moreover, the irregularities in documentation coupled with the 2003 Citizenship Amendment Act leaves the Hindu Waqas refugees leaves for the Hindu lower caste refugees is the Citizenship Amendment Act, the only way to gain citizenship at present, and the liberal call to boycott the CAA along with the NRC therefore does not sit well with the SC/OBC refugees. And without this citizenship, their status vis-a-vis the larger politics of Asansol and West Bengal remains contested. So what I want to end by saying that given the recent electoral results where the the Namasudras in large numbers have voted for the BJP, their support has come to be questioned as something self-defeating that is guided by false consciousness, and almost they have voted, and it's understood by the secular elite as if they have voted against their own interests. What is interesting is that the entire burden of bringing in communalism to Bengal has fallen on their shoulders, whereas the support of the Hindu Bhadralok elite to the project of like communal Hindu nationalism, communalism in Bengal, especially in its support to BJP, has remained unexamined. In fact, Rajat Rai, however, has pointed out that the Namashudra support for BJP is rather pragmatic, given this is the only tool they have for navigating and negotiating with the demands of citizenship, and having some negotiating power, bargaining power vis-a-vis the incumbent political power in the state. However, it's funny that in a twist of the narrative, people like Shunanda Datta Ke Rai have been argued that this pragmatism is vile and ideologically bankrupt, whereby the more ideologically committed Hindu Bhadralok fundamentalist comes across as a worthier political opponent, and which is why figures like Tathagata Rai seem to have more credibility in the Hindu Bhadralok imagination. So I end by arguing that it is basically the Hindu Bhadralok caste elite's interest in maintaining its domination that particularly creates this division between the Dalit Muslim interests, and and it has to be sorted out on its own terms by these two groups whose interests have been pitted against each other by the need to consolidate caste hegemony, and it cannot come from the and it cannot be sort of dropped by the, or it cannot be charted by the secular elite who are as invested in secular progressive elite who are as interested in maintaining their hegemony. Thank you.
Thank you, Ekta. So I see that we have only 16 minutes left for this discussion. So Rohit, I mean, is that correct? Am I right in believing that we have only 15 minutes?
No, actually, we are free to extend. We don't have 15 minutes. We technically, I think we have 20 minutes on the dot, or 15, 20. Yeah, on my watch it's 20, 15 on some.
Okay.
But we will extend this. Sophie and Professor Bhargava, is it okay if we extend this by a few minutes? Will you be available?
I could be extended by 10 minutes or so. And if that is the case, then I will say a couple of things before I ask Sophie to give more specific comments on the 4 papers and then the responses from others. My first point is that we must recognize that this is something which is well known, and I'm very glad that Razak brought in Wilfred Cantwell Smith, who is an outstanding scholar of comparative religion, and whose book, The Meaning and End of Religion, is one of the real classics of modern comparative religion. I think we have to recognize that modern religion is religion is a modern product, something that emerged in the 15th, 16th century during the so-called wars of religion. And not only that, it is also very deeply intertwined with the emergence of the modern nation state. We go back to 1492 to Spain, when really an idea of a predominantly single religion nation, that idea came to be formed with the expulsion of Jews and Muslims from what was then Spanish territory. So not only has the history of both modern religion and modern nation states, these histories are deeply entwined with each other, and they have inbuilt into them from the very beginning. They have created problems, and to meet these problems. I mean, I can't go into all these problems. I mean, the very idea of modern religion, I see it in the following way, that there are two sort of elements which tend to be identified with religion. One is the element of one is what we can call an ethic of self-realization, and the other, which are norms of social interaction, social norms, and the relationship between them. These two in any society can be either very loose or it can be very tight. And what happens with the emergence of modern religion is that the relation between ethics and norms of social interaction becomes extremely tight. So that if you have a particular ethic, then you have to be committed to a particular set of particular normative set of social interactions, and this idea of a comprehensive system is a very European idea. It's something which is it contained within it a number of problems, including problems of belonging and therefore of citizenship and linked to that nation states and so on. And to resolve these problems, I mean, there are three responses to these problems. One response is that it's not a problem at all, that we should have more of the same. The second is to recognize the problem, but try and sort this problem out from within the resources of one religion. And I think a lot of European solutions are of that variety, that it's only within Christianity, the separation of church and state, accepting a broader premise of religion to solve the problems that are created by modern religion. And the third, of course, is a solution in which the problems of modern religion and problems of modern nation state can be resolved by using some resources of religion, but you also have to resort to resources outside a single religion and sometimes outside religion altogether. So it's not that you leave religion out completely when you're looking for resources for the solution of the problems that are created by modern religion and modern nation states, but that those are never sufficient and got to go outside. And that's probably what I believe is the secular position. And that's where there is no dichotomy between religion and secular, but there is a very important difference between the religious and the secular. So, if you look at it in this perspective, I would say that the Indian situation and the Western European situation in particular, or the North Atlantic, or the Western situation, I think we are really going in opposite directions. And here maybe I disagree with with Enrico. I think instead of there being some convergence, I think the direction is the movement of these two societies in exactly the opposite direction. The Europeans are trying to get out of the problems of modern religion and modern nation state. They are looking for what they call post-secular and what Charles said as called, the deep secularity, the condition of deep secularity. I mean, the idea is that religion, that there are plural options. There is no single default position. most people can choose either a secular or a religious, and this kind of pluralism is there, but you can have different spiritualities, you can be an atheist, you can be an agnostic, or you can be a committed believer in any religion. But all of these possibilities have come in response to the crisis of Christianity and Christian confessional religious states. And in India, on the other hand, you have a condition of what we might call post-secularity. The very term secular, religious, post-secular doesn't really apply to the Indian condition until the 18th century. Once you have this category of religion, there are all these problems of responding to these problems of religion and nation state begin to arise, and we seem to have today adopted a very classical European solution to that problem. We've left our own history and our kind of a cultural and intellectual lineage, and suddenly, take a solution. But the West, not successfully, but the West is trying to give up through their secularism. So we are sort of moving in a direction of Hindu nationalism, whereas until recently, at least, a lot of the Western European trajectory has been, and even the North Atlantic trajectory, not successfully, because there are all sorts of contestations and challenges, been moving in the opposite direction. So that's my first point. I think it encompasses both the issues that were raised about citizenship and nationalism, religion, secular, and so on, and the issues that are raised by Enrico. I would also say something about, Cantwell Smith. There is a personal anecdote that I'd like to share. I was at one, American university as a fellow, and I was invited to talk about the historiography and the end of empire. And this is a conference that was organized by Natalie Davis and Gyan Prakash in Princeton. And it was at that time that I started to read Wilfred Cantwell Smith seriously. I read Modern Islam in India, and I was very impressed by some of the things that he said in that book. I quoted him in the paper that I was preparing, but I borrowed the book from the library, so I returned that book, and at the very end of when I completed the paper, I had missed some references, so I went back and picked up brought the book back from the library, and what I discovered was that I was actually, somehow something strange had happened. Some of the things in the same book appear to be very different. For example, in the 1946, in the first, in the book that I borrowed the first time, there was Cantwell Smith had a very strong critique of the Muslim League, and he was very sympathetic to the Congress Nehru position. But when I read the book the second time, that entire chapter was missing, and in place of that, there was another chapter which was, praising Muslim League to the skies, and I found that very strange. Still, I discovered that the first edition was published from London in 1946, and the second edition was published from Lahore in 1948, and it was very clear that something had happened. Something very dramatic had happened. Some government official had decided to use the book for very chauvinistic purposes, dropped an entire chapter against the Muslim League and replaced it by another. I don't know whether Cantwell Smith had any idea about it. I didn't know whether Cantwell Smith himself changed his position, because I hadn't read very much else of Cantwell Smith. But I stuck my neck out, and in my paper I used it as the involvement of nationalist passion in the manufacturing of history, which is a point I think that was made by, highlighted by Sajjad. And it was only, about 10 years. Catholic was still alive at that time. I knew that he was in Canada. He retired from Harvard. But I didn't write to him. I should have, because as I read more and more of him, I thought he was just absolutely superb. But 5 or 6 years later, in another book, a small footnote, he did mention that somebody had played around with his 1946 original edition, and some invisible hand had twisted some of his some chapters, and so my initial hunch was proven to be correct, that this had fallen victim to some super nationalist, hyper nationalist passion. So yes, we have very similar situation today. It's been happening in India. It's something that at that time, living under the shadow of Gandhi and Nehru and with all sorts of historians, I thought that something had happened only in Pakistan. But of course, I should have known better. This was happening in India. I mean, as we all know, I knew that, but I thought it was marginal. But something that this kind of manufactured history, totally distorted history, based on the collective memory of a few alienated souls, I think that has become center stage now, and we have to reckon with it. And that brings me to my last point, which is about Ekta's. And I completely agree with her that this is one of the biggest failures of secular liberal thinkers. They didn't recognize there was an official policy of forgetting, and that policy is just not worked. People don't forget, and in fact, people who've been wronged and people who were all sorts of people wronged, people from different communities, both communities were wronged, not only different communities, but within communities across caste and gender. These wrongs have to be addressed, and so there has to be some remembrance. Of course, excessive remembrance can also be very damaging. You can't create a future society if you keep remembering all the past wrongs. On the other hand, you can't create a future society if you were to try to forget everything, because that doesn't work either. So an appropriate form of remembrance and an appropriate forgetting, both are absolutely essential. There is an ethics here. Ethics, it will change. If you want to live together, you will construct a different past. You will have a different cultural memory, a different collective memory. If you don't want to live with each other, you will have a completely different. So I think that decision, which is an ethical decision of whether to stay, how much you value solidarity, so that's extremely important. And I think Ekata's paper brought that point. But actually, all the four papers are absolutely, fascinating, and love to read more of this stuff. Each of these papers threw a new light on the subject that they were handling, and all of them were extremely interesting, and they kept me completely hooked for every minute I was there. So thank you very, very much. Sorry for having taken more time than I should have, but I now pass. Sophie, it's all yours. You conduct the proceedings from now on. You give your comments, and then if there is time, we can have question answers.
Thank you. So just for housekeeping, for the audience, if you have questions, please write the word question into the chat box. If we run out of time, then please email your questions to the organizers, who will then forward them to the speakers themselves. Right, so firstly, Well, thank you so much to the speakers and as well as to Professor Bhargava's comment. It was really a thought-provoking hour, or a little over an hour, and I feel like I've learned quite a lot from your projects. Given the wide spectrum of the papers at hand under the umbrella of rethinking the communal, the sacral, and the secular, my questions will also be broad in nature. Before I jump into my individual question, I think the range of topics and methodologies displayed by the presenters today show the multiple ways of engaging with notions of secular and sacred. The role of individuals or historical actors as a lens to understanding the tension between secular and sacred realms displayed by Dr. Sajjad and Dr. Khan, juxtaposed with Ekata Bakshi's work on a large pool of rich lived experiences, present to us the sheer extensiveness and ubiquitousness of these boundaries at work at various scales. Another thing that I'd be very curious to hear about during the Q&A is the relationship and tension between identity, citizenship, and minorityhood, and the power and limits of the nation as a category through which one cultivates, transforms, and negotiates one's belonging. So with that, I will start with Dr. Beltramini. Thank you for your paper. I really enjoyed, because these days I'm more and more getting into these relationship between public and the state. So I really enjoyed your introduction to secularization, and especially your point about the ambiguous nature of secular governance. Very useful in understanding the relationship between the state and the government, which are always often changing, and the public. I have 2 points, 2 responses to your paper. First is the usefulness of theology. I wondered whether a turn to social and intellectual history of religion could be also beneficial here, and I'd be very keen to hear your thought on this distinction. Here I'm thinking about historians of religion and U.S. liberalism in U.S. America, such as Andrew Preston and Helena Rosenblatt, who have, in a way, showed how American ideas of nationhood, imperialism, and internationalism, or even American globalism, to borrow Andrew Preston's phrasing, was imbued with Christian ideas, so religious ideas. So the porousness of the boundaries that are drawn almost makes, I think, post-secularity a bit redundant. And my second point to your paper is the directionality of the issue that was raised just now by Professor Bhargava. Here I'm thinking about, so whether it would be an useful and interesting exercise to think in the opposite direction as well. So to sort of think about whether the West is looking more and more like India when it comes to navigating in its constructive boundaries of religion in the private and the public spheres. And here I'm also thinking about the category of spirituality as it emerged in the West, especially in US America. It of course has a very long history of engagement with various traditions in South Asia. And as Srinivas Aravamudan has argued in his Guru English, South Asian religions have been appropriated in various movements and discourses within the USA, both in the sort of more explicitly political spheres, but also in civil societies as well. So I wondered whether you could think with us a little bit about the opposite directionality, or whether that would actually be helpful in your project as well. I'll move on to the next comment. So I thought it'd be useful if I just went through the comments and then turn the table to the speakers themselves. Dr. Sajjad, thank you for your paper. I think it's so important, right? It really, your paper highlights the universal trend that we see, which is the appropriation and misappropriation of historical figures to the national framework. My personal research is on Vivekananda. That's my first monograph that I'm working on, who is also very much of a controversial figure who is constantly appropriated and misappropriated in various narratives. So I found your paper in that in that way very engaging for me. I have two questions for you as well. The first one is the writing of history and distribution of ideas. And so how were these rebranding of Ulama shared and dissipated to the public? And through what mediums? What about the resistance to these, or counter-public to these narratives? So if you could speak a little bit more on the texture of the public sphere that is generated in this rewriting of history, and in which these figures are represented and debated and also resisted. And then my second question is a little bit broad as well. Does the notion of the sacred and the sacral and these narratives of rewriting of history and rewriting of historical figures beneficial and useful to your project? So that would be my broad question for you. The next questions or set of questions I have is for Dr. Khan. I'm very much interested in global biographies and figures who are very mobile. So your paper was very fascinating for me in that sense as well. I have many questions, but I think I'll stick with two for now. So first one is, you didn't push this argument too much in the presentation, but it came out very strongly in the paper, is a global aspect of your paper. And I just wondered to what extent the global dimension is helpful for you. Because, I mean, in the example that you give, and in Abid Husain's mobility itself, I mean, global is really Europe and North America, isn't it? And that kind of matches with your argument about the importance of the Cold War context as well. So I would like to hear a bit more about your engagement with the global as a category of understanding the knowledge production of modern Islamic studies. And the second question is emotional history. I understand that you have your own history, academic and intellectual journey with emotional history, and I found it very, very fascinating, especially because in the paper as well you highlight these phrases such as general feeling of despair, sympathy, and respect. And how these emotional tropes appear in Husain's writings as well. So within your project, but also broadly, in your opinion, what role does the history of emotion play in understanding the porous boundaries and categories of the secular and the sacred? So those are my two questions. And lastly, to Ekata Bakshi. Ekata, thank you so much for your rich paper. I mean, it was really a joy to read, and I learned quite a lot from it. So I think my question for you is a very broad question and perhaps ambitious. It's a two-part question. So the first is, how does religion, rather than secularity and the sacral, apply in your project for you as a researcher, but also in your engagement with the people that you've interviewed? I mean, to what extent are these categories that we academics are using in our, classroom and wherever we are actually helpful in understanding the lived experiences of refugees? So, that would be the end of my question. I just got a prompt from Rohit. If you could please limit your responses to 2 minutes, that would be great.
Right. So first of all, thank you, the both of you, Professor Bhargava and you, Sophie, for your comments. So I will try to answer in 2 minutes. Also, because now it's 6 o'clock in the morning in California, so I feel better than 2 hours ago when it was 4 o'clock in the morning. So about the methodology, let me put it this way. So it's been quite, I would say, a given that the religious is positioned by history, politics, sociology, and all of these secular disciplines. I think it would be nice sometimes that theology actually position the religion. I would say even worse, because it's 6 o'clock in the morning, that might be sometimes is good if actually theology positions everything, the religious and the secular. Why? Well, because we are used to do exactly the opposite. And if we want to escape this mental gate that says that basically the secular has to position everything, we can try, just as a scholarly experiment, to do exactly the opposite and to see if as eventually theology can position everything, including the secular. And so I'm not saying in my paper I did this, but I imply this kind of possibility. As for the directionality, of course, 1 minute is not enough to answer if India can be a benchmark as far as secular and post-secular to the rest of the world, or at least to the West, or the other way around. I can't pretend to be able to answer this question in 45 seconds. But my personal impression is that the distinctiveness of India was actually more pronounced in the past than actually right now. And I take as an example the incredible modernization of the Indian society, starting, I would say, in the early 90s and continuing today. This quick emerging modernization is actually bringing India to face problems that eventually the West faced in the past, when I don't say the same kind of modernization, but actually not very different kind of modernization took place. So to stay in the 1 minute, I would say yes, as a scholarly experiment, we can see the opposite direction to see if the India can be a benchmark for the West. But I would say also that the West in this moment can provide some kind of not guidelines, not direction, just experiences that might help India to reframe the present moment, maybe.
All right, I'm up. Should I? Yes. Well, thank you. Well, thank you for those questions and your comments. They were very. I felt like I was back in my dissertation viva or something. I actually tackled that first question of yours quite a bit in terms of what's the public sphere, who are the audiences for these texts, and in a way, I've divided things between a religious, Urdu-speaking, class-based, religious public sphere and an English-speaking, English-writing, mostly elite academic public sphere. And what I'm arguing is that a lot of these texts are written for the masses, for people who either fall within the traditions of these religious groups, who want to emphasize the sacredness of their traditions historically, or increasingly the one place where I think some intersection is taking place between both these public spheres are these Urdu language online websites, where both of them are beginning to tackle some of these issues together. So they're not resisted in a sense. However, the one place where they've now come out in ways that was not the case maybe around even 5 or 10 years ago is social media. So Facebook has become that one major platform in which these people are being taught, these older scholars are being taught anew opinions about their specific aspects of their lives, in as much as they have to do something about with Pakistan and its independence, come out a lot. So these groups go into overdrive sometimes around August 14th. Every year commemorating August 14th independence of Pakistan with an idea about, see, our group was more in touch with Pakistan. So that's happening a lot. In terms of a second question, So one way I think in which the secular and the sacral and these concepts affect my understanding, well, first of all, the way that these groups have ended up even translating the word secular as Ladin, which is devoid of religion, in itself makes secular a problematic word. I think it's once more on those websites, those new platforms where in Urdu writing, the word secular is being written in the Arabic script as secular itself, so that it's actually entered the Urdu language, where that idea about the absence of religion, the nullification of religion is finally being rectified. That's taking place now. What I will say is this, that in the case of Pakistan, it can be quite simplistic, but affiliating your traditional history of your ulama to a sort of sacred history of Pakistan's religious identity is sometimes so simplistic. I mean, I'm thinking of, I'll end with this, one conversation I had with the Barelvi scholar who told me, for example, that Pakistani textbooks honor Sir Syed Ahmad Khan, a modernist late 19th century figure who in general is highly regarded by Pakistani nationhood as waking Muslims up from the slumber of their forefathers and everything. And that scholar telling me that it is forbidden, haram, for people to send their children to secular schools in Pakistan because those schools categorize Sir Syed Ahmad Khan as a hero. In this regard, that political history itself becomes secular because Sir Syed Ahmad Khan had certain opinions that the traditional scholars differed with. So in that sense, even creating these terms today and appropriating the ulama of the past, the scholars of the past, and using these terms anachronistically for them today, I think is central to my understanding of these figures. I don't know if that answers your question, but that's what I was thinking about when I heard that.
Okay. If I may quickly answer those two very perceptive and insightful questions. Okay, the first is the temporality of global. What I wanted to suggest, and it comes better, I think, in the book, is to think of different domains of making of cosmopolitanism, starting with rooted cosmopolitanism of the Muslim princely state. That's why Allahabad is important, because it was a nationalist institution. I mentioned his disenchantment with Aligarh, because although he later worked at Aligarh, he's not an Aligarhi Muslim. Jami in that sense is also different globality. Similarly, the experiment at Osmania represent a different temporal of globalization. I write about this in much better in a forthcoming article, which looks at the Jewish origin of India's Muslim universities. So I look at 3 Jewish scholars of Islam at 3 Muslim universities, which is to think of globalization not in Europe, but in the colony as a site of the debate. What I presented here is the after history of the Cold War, reframing of that global moment. And for me, in the thesis, a large part of it is in Weimar, Berlin, and I think there is a lack here because I did not talk too much about it, but that's very much so. I'm looking at both different temporalities and different spaces of global intellectual history. It doesn't come too well in the short paper, but that's an important aspect when writing global intellectual history, not just the time, but also the spaces of it. Okay, so that's the point, very well taken. Regarding history of emotion and writing on this I think is both a challenge as well as a possibility. I think history of emotion has so far been more sort of the idea of the contained subject, and it has largely remained about individual subjects, but the affect of the nation, as it were, the emotion of nation and its minority citizenship would require a different methodology, both at the intersection of history of emotion, but also affect, but increasingly what a lot of people are calling history of experience. What is the history of experience of secularism? How do people actually experience it? And a lot of the writing here is about experiencing and cultivating those emotions. So although I have highlighted individual practices, as it were, but and a film like a Muslim festival in India is about creating a religious festival into secular festival. So it's both an embodied, carried, performed emotion, but it's also in between the nation and one might call secularism as the emotion of nation in a way, or a particular belief of to borrow Cantwell Smith's argument, the belief argument from the religious to the national. I want to just also thank Professor Bhargava for mentioning his own personal insight and anecdotes. They were very useful. Okay.
Should I go? Yeah. So I think I'll keep it really short. But first of all, thank you, Professor Dr. Jung-Kim, that insufferably long paper you had read, and you had such beautiful things to say. Thank you. So yes, on the note on methodology, I have been trying to think of anti-caste as methodology. And what does it mean for taking anti-caste as methodology? Following the work of Prathama Banerjee and Aloysius, then there is a very interesting thing that comes up, that who is the minority? Technically, the Hindu Bhadralok elite is the minority in they were the minority in East Bengal, the United Bengal and West Bengal, which is why partition had to take place. So this idea of minority itself changes if you take anti-caste as methodology. And I mean, it forges new possibilities of the Dalit Muslim Bahujan unity, but on their own terms. And I feel that anti-caste as a methodology inherently questions the category of the nation, and at least builds up possibilities of South Asia-wide interactions. Okay. The second question, the lived experiences. So yes, there is this entire literature about how there are grassroots faith-based practices, or this idea of little traditions in sociology, if I'm getting it correctly. But here I draw from my friend Santana Kumar, who says that identity is primarily about identification. So what does the upper caste state apparatus identify practices as? Yes, there are multiple practices, and which might be seen as Hindu or not. But quickly, I could point out that in the case of Asansol, there was a tribal goddess, lower caste goddess called Ghagurguri, which has now the temple has now been reworked into being the RSS almost headquarters in Asansol. So, yes, there are lived experiences, but I'm more interested in how these lived experiences are identified, and then how they feed into, and then how people are asked to reproduce such identities, and what it means for that kind of politics. Thank you.
We'll end it here, I think. We'll end it here. Thank you, Professor Bhargav. Thank you, Sophie. And thank you to all the panelists and the other attendees. We have a panel coming up. You'll find the panel link on the website. Thank you, everyone. So if you have any further questions for the presenters, you can mail them to the organizers. Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you.